Thanks to Razor, you can write C# in a markup of a component. And in Blazor, separate code segments for a component can also be added, like this. I'm adding a private field CSS class in the profile picture component. It has the initial value circle. I can now insert the value of the variable anywhere I want in the markup. For example, in the CSS attribute of the img, simply by typing the field name with the @ sign. I'm replacing the static string with a variable with the same value here. So this won't lead to a visible change in layout for now. But this is just the first step. I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of having code and markup mixed in one file, especially when a component gets more complex. Luckily, there are other ways to do it. You can give the Razor file the equivalent of a code behind file, if you're familiar with that, separating the markup from the code. Here's how to do it. Create a class. The name doesn't matter, but it's a good thing to follow some kind of convention. For example, in this project, all code behind classes are called component name followed with base. But why does that make sense? Why is it called base? You don't see it in the Solution Explorer, but behind the scenes a class is generated for the Razor code for each file with the Razor extension. By default, the generated code isn't put in a visible file, but this can be turned on by setting emit compiler generated files in the CSproj file. When I now open File Explorer in the Solution folder and search for files with the g.cs extension, there's a file for each component. And let's open the one that represents the profile picture component. The code is clearly less suitable for human eyes with all these directives, but you can see the generated class derives from component base and overrides build render tree to render the UI element by element in code. Looking at it, I'm glad we devs don't have to write this. Here you can see that every component we render in Razor is eventually translated into pure code. We also see the private field we defined. Now back to the class I created for code separation. Why did I create this class using base as a suffix? The reason is it is intended as the base class for the class generated from the Razor file, instead of the default component base. Let me illustrate. Without a code behind file, the class hierarchy looks like this. The generated class derives from component base. In the scenario with a code behind file, the generated class will inherit from the base class, and the base class from component base. So the new class we created has to derive from component base. And I can now move the field we already had in the code block from the Razor file to the new class. We now have to tell the Razor part of the component that it has to inherit from the new class instead of from component base. And we can do that by putting @inherits followed by the class name in it. But there's a problem now with the reference to the CSS class field. Can you guess what it is? The CSS class field now isn't in the same class as the markup anymore. And it was defined as private. So the field must be at least protected. But leaving fields exposed for the outside isn't recommended. So in this case, a property is a better choice. In the Razor we can now adjust for the casing and get rid of the code block. And our profile picture component will now work as before. Just run the project yourself if you don't believe me. The advantage of using inherited classes as the files containing the code for our components is that we can put in as many class layers we want, as long as we eventually derive from component base. If there is some common functionality for all components, just create an extra layer in the component hierarchy, such as here for components for Bethany's Pie Shop as an example. But there's another way to create code behind classes. The classes generated from Razor are partial classes, and that means we can create another part of the class in another file. At compile time, these files will be merged into one class. I'll show you how to do it for the profile picture component. I'm getting rid of the inherits directive for now and create a new class. If you give the file name the razor.cs extension, Visual Studio will nest the file under the component if you have that option enabled. The class declaration has to specify that it is partial, and it also should have the same name as the component, and it should be in the same namespace as the component. We can then copy the CSS class property into the file. Note that this approach has nothing to do with inheritance. It is just extending an existing class. That means that partial classes aren't suitable for providing reusable base functionality. It also means that you can use the private field again instead of the property. For this project, I want to stick to inheritance, just to be consistent with the rest of the code. So I'm reverting back to using the base class as soon as I've finished recording this clip.